welcome. Thank you for coming to my talk. My name's Josephine. My pronouns are she, her. And in the next couple of minutes, I will be talking about web accessibility and what you can do to get started. Before we get started, I would like to quickly introduce myself and how I got into web accessibility. I joined web development, I guess, from what you could say is a non-traditional background, so through a programming bootcamp. In a previous life, I once worked in communications and online marketing. And after the front-end bootcamp, I got my job as a first job as a developer in a digital agency, and we're working for different clients. But actually, the first one I was working for, they had to implement web accessibility in order to comply with the legal requirements for different markets. And so that was quite interesting because it concerned a large legacy code base, many different stakeholders. We had quite a short time to get things done right. And it was a new topic for most people on the project, also rather experienced developers. And so I was hooked because for me, it was just something new to learn. And I was really motivated because it was something that I felt like had a positive impact for a large community of people. So that's kind of how I got started with web accessibility. These days, I work as a developer relations engineer at Storyblock. Storyblock is a fully remote company that offers a headless CMS. They're also hiring. If you're looking for a job, feel free to get in touch with them or with me if you have any questions. But it's enough about me, so let's dive right in. I will just provide a little bit of theoretical background information before we get started, so we all have a common ground to start from. So what is web accessibility and why is it important? Web accessibility basically means tools, technologies, and websites are designed and implemented so that people with disability can use them to participate equally on the web. It's also a basic human right as defined by the United Nations. If you're still wondering if web accessibility is something for you or the people you want to visit your website, maybe let this number sink in. So based on a report from the World Health Organization, worldwide, over 15% of the population experience some form of disability, and that's over 1 billion people. And of course, it's difficult to measure the experience of disability, especially globally. That's really hard to do. But even if it's just a ballpark number, 1 billion is quite a big one. And yeah, just the sheer number is quite impressive. And then, of course, as a society, we are growing older in general. And so this number is just going to get even bigger. I'm hoping that even if you're coming at this from like a business perspective, maybe that just the sheer amount of people that is affected and their massive spending power convinces you that this is also relevant for you. And if that's not enough, let's have a look at the different user groups that might be affected. For example, people with different kinds of disabilities like physical, auditory, cognitive, neurological, speech, or visual disabilities. But web accessibility also benefits people without disabilities. So I don't know, maybe you are using the internet from a device that has a really small screen or a smartwatch, or that uses different kinds of input methods, so maybe speech commands. Older people, as I already mentioned, have different abilities due to aging, and that's something that's going to affect all of us at some point. And then in this table here, you can see there's also temporary disabilities. So that could mean maybe you just lost your glasses or you have a broken arm. And they're talking about situational limitations. So maybe you are in bright sunlight, or you have a really slow internet connection, for example, or maybe you are in an environment where you can't turn up the volume, so like a library, for example, or on the train. And then web accessibility can also come in very handy. What does that look like in practice? So it could, for example, mean providing transcripts or captions for video, offering different kinds of input methods like the mouse, of course, but also keyboard, speech commands, maybe being open to assistive technology, or explaining unfamiliar terms, for example. Speaking of unfamiliar terms, there are a couple of terms that are used quite often when talking about web accessibility, and I just want to clear them up quickly so we can get them out of the way. So the first one is the abbreviation A11Y, or sometimes pronounced as ALI. That just stands for accessibility, and the 11 is the 11 letters between the A and the Y. Then we have the WCAG, so the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Those are providing a shared international standards to comply by with different levels of accessibility. So A, AA, and AAA are these different levels, and AAA is the strictest one, you could say, the one with the most rules and the most inclusive as well. And these are part of the Web Accessibility Initiative, so WAI. They are providing documentation, background information, all the context that you need to get started as well. So now that we broadly know what it is and are hopefully convinced that this is really important, let's dive right in. Just before we get started, a little disclaimer. So I'm going to mention some tools. This is just personal preference. I have no affiliation with them whatsoever. It's just what I like to use or get used to, but I'm really open to learn about new tools. So feel free to reach out or get in touch if you have something that you really like and can recommend. I'm very much looking forward to that. The first thing we're going to talk about is semantic HTML. So here we are really laying the foundation for all other things web accessibility. Semantic HTML basically means that we're using the HTML elements for their given purpose. So that could mean using an H1 as a headline, for example, using an A if we're trying to convey a link, for example, or UL for an unordered list. So all these HTML tags, they have an intended use. And if we use that instead of just divs, we give the page structure and context rather than just representation. Of course, you could use CSS and JavaScript to make the page look and feel the way you want it to, but there are many good reasons not to do that. One of them being, as I just mentioned already, the structure that we are providing. That is very important for people who use screen readers, for example, because this background structure is what helps them navigate the page. There are also some default styles and basic functionalities that are built in HTML. So like we see the button there on the right-hand side. That is something that might not look pretty or it might not be your taste, but it's something you can work with and that many people are familiar with. And you can, of course, override these styles if you wanted to, but you have things like it's already interactive. You can tap there with the keyboard, you can click it or submit, enter, and then select it. So that comes in really handy, and else you would have to build it in manually. Or different cursor styles, for example. That's also something that indicates to the user, hey, there's something going on here, right? And then apart from that, it helps structure the code, makes it easier to maintain and to understand, which also increases SEO and performance, because search engine crawlers generally function a little bit like the assistive technology, right? So they look for landmarks and they go through those. So that's quite handy. And if you want to improve the semantic HTML on your site, you could return to your code and check, well, is there maybe a more precise element that you can use? Or how did you use the HTML tags that are already there? What is the difference between, for example, an article and an aside? You could make sure you have all the alt attributes filled out with meaningful context for the users. Putting the correct input type really helps. For example, if you want users to put in a phone number and you have the input type number, that will directly, also on mobile, for example, jump to the number pad, and it's just a lot easier to fill that out. Providing labels is really important. Yeah, and if you've done all that and you're feeling brave, you can go turn off CSS in your browser and see what is put out there. So it might not look super pretty, but you get a general idea of the structure and if it's still logical and understandable. We'll move over to the next important topic for web accessibility. This is actually one of the things that is done wrong most of the time. So one of the biggest issues when it comes to web accessibility is it's color contrast. So color and contrast are very important to web accessibility. It's basically there's measured the difference in luminance or brightness, you could say, which is perceived for the different colors. So what that could look like, we can see it here. So we want the content to be perceivable, right? So the background and the foreground have to have a limit, certain limit, basically. And you see those numbers here. 4.5 is the score that you need to comply with the WCAG, so the rules that I mentioned in the beginning, level AA. And that's the most common that people try to comply to, I guess, the middle one. And if you would have, for example, white writing on white background, that's 1:1. And then if you have black on white, that would be 21:1. So those are the different scores you could get into to see here. And yeah, high contrast really helps for people with visual impairments. And something that you want to consider, though, depending on who your audience is that really, really bright colors might not be so easy for people who have reading disabilities. So that depends a little bit on what your needs and your users are, but that's something to consider when it comes to color contrast. We will move over to the browser. I'm just going to switch my window here and have a look at a cool tool that I found. That's the Web Disability Simulator. And here you could, for example, say, okay, so what would my site look like if I had total color blindness? I can apply that, and you see here it's lots of shades of gray, basically. You could also reset that and set it to, for example, red and green color blindness, right? That's also something that's quite common. And you see an estimate of what that could look like for people. This is quite handy. Of course, it's not entirely accurate, and these things vary from person to person a little bit, but it gives you a good idea. You can also, I think, check for, totals for sunshine. So like really bright sunshine on your screen. If you turn that on, you see it's already like quite hard to read a couple of things. So that's also really good to check if your contrast is high enough to comply with that. And because that's not super accurate, there are other tools like color contrast checkers. It's also quite handy. So if I wanted to check, for example, if here the background and the foreground, so the writing, have sufficient contrast for the level that I'm trying to comply with, I can do that here. I can check another one, for example, this little button here. But it's looking good. So you see we comply with all the different levels in the different sizes, and 13 is a really, really good score. We need 4.5, so that's quite good to read for sure. And those are just some handy tools that you can use to check the color contrast. We'll move on to our last topic for today, and that's keyboard accessibility. So keyboard accessibility is important, especially for people with motor disabilities. For example, they rely on a keyboard. Some users of assistive technology also depend on that or have modified keyboards maybe that they want to use. Blind users typically use a keyboard for navigation as well. And also in general, for user experience, it might be quite nice to be able, at the end of a long day, not to have to use the mouse anymore, but to be able to tap through a site, for example. It's really fast and efficient, and just generally good user experience. What's important here is that you want to make sure all the interactive elements are reachable via keyboard. So I should be able to get there with my tab key or navigate with the different arrows, select something with an enter or a space bar, for example, and be able to use the site like that. It's not only important to get there, but you also have to make sure users can tab away so there's no focus trap. there's some like very specific cases in which you might want that. So I don't know, maybe you want users to be trapped in a modal or something, agree to something, and then move on to the website. But generally, you do want to make sure there is no way that users cannot get out just with a keyboard and then have to use a mouse if that's something that's maybe not possible for them. You want to make sure the tab order is in a logical flow. So just the way you would read it, you want the page to be able to tab, the users be able to tab through the site. I used a tool called Tab Ally on the right here, and you see that visualizes quite nicely the different stops I would make on my journey if I tab through the site. It's quite handy if you want to see maybe you missed something. And then you want to be sure that all the functionality that you have via the mouse, you also have through the keyboard. So that could also be, for example, things that you only get on hover. You want to make sure this is not something you're excluding other users from. You want the focus style to be visible, also very important. So you need to know where you are at all times, right? If you're not using the mouse, you want to know where the focus is currently. That's just generally very important. You could, if you can't see it, could, for example, go in the dev tools and type document active element in the console, and there it should put out for you where that is. And you want to avoid things like outline none, for example, or outline 0, which eliminates the focus style, and that's just not very handy. It's a really good challenge to try for one day or 1 hour, maybe, to use just your keyboard to browse your favorite sites. Or try to work like that, or maybe do some shopping online and see how far it gets you and what challenges you encounter. And that way it might be a bit easier to understand the needs of different users. That was already it. That was the end of my talk. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it was helpful to you. And just one last thing I want to give you on the way. In the case of web accessibility, 10% is better than nothing. So it's an ongoing process. Every small step counts. And what are you waiting for? Just get started, do something small, check your alt tags, for example, check some HTML elements, or maybe the color contrast. Try that out, try to improve a small thing today, and you're gonna start going on that journey. If you have any questions about anything that I talked about today, about web accessibility, about Storyblok, feel free to reach out. Contact me on Twitter or in LinkedIn or wherever you can find me. I can't wait for it. Thank you so much.